Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is Charlotte. Thank you so much for joining us. We're also joined by James from People Coach. Thanks for everyone for getting in there and having a crack at the question in the chat box. It's good to see already we've started off with a bit of engagement. That was a little experiment from me. I'm trying to get rid of the awkward start of a webinar where there's like some people joining and others not here yet. So feel free to give me feedback in the chat box if you thought that was very awkward and very cringe. I'm very open to hearing your feedback. So welcome to today's webinar where we are talking about how we can thrive as a leader in a complex world. So I'm so happy to be joined by James, and we're so happy to be bringing together the Inventium and People Coach community. We are so thrilled that we had around 580 people register for this webinar. So if you're here live, welcome. If you're catching up on the recording, you are also very, very welcome. So I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are joining from. I know we're all joining from very different places around the world. So I'm joining you from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So if you do know the traditional land on which you're joining from today, please do say hello in the chat box. Let us know where you are joining us from. So this is a piece of artwork that we commissioned at Inventium by an artist called Casey Ray. She's an Aboriginal artist, and this work really symbolizes and tells the story of the work that we do at Inventium. So I'm going to use this to help introduce Inventium, because I know that some of you are from the People Coach community, a large number of you are, and so you might not know us from Inventium. So basically in the top left-hand side of this artwork, these pictures really symbolize the act of us gathering information through research and client conversations. So at Inventium, we are obsessed with the science behind things like the world of work and people and culture. So we look at research in areas like organizational psychology, neuroscience, and business management. And we really seek to understand how we can take that research and convert that into insights and tools that are really practical for creating really progressive and pioneering workplaces. So the piece of artwork in the center, the center really depicts the ever-changing nature of the workplace, and we are constantly trying to guide our clients through this. And the right-hand side of the artwork, this is where we kind of bring all of the insights together, and this culminates in this circular artwork, which depicts cohesive and high-performing work teams and organizations. So essentially at Inventium, we're here to bring the world of research and turn that into practical tools to create better workplaces. And so, James, I want to say a little hello to you and get you to do a quick introduction to yourself and People Coach as well.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and fantastic. Welcome to country and acknowledgement. And sorry, I should say acknowledgement, but also that artwork's amazing. Far more than, I guess, a cursory sort of intro that we often see. So, yeah, great way to start. People Coach, for those especially who are more on the Inventium side or coming through from that community, People Coach, our whole mission and purpose is to bring a coaching-led leadership development approach into people that are traditionally excluded, mainly through pricing of executive coaching in its traditional format. So a lot of executive coaching and development over the many years has been very much targeted towards senior execs and leaving behind emerging and developing leaders. So we generally service clients with a decent number of emerging and developing leaders and making sure that they receive some guidance through coaching and through some content to become more effective leaders and develop into greater, more effective leaders and have fulfilling careers. So I'd say that's a brief intro to People Coach, and I'm co-founder of the company.
Awesome. Thanks, James. So, for those of you that also don't know me, my background is I'm an organizational psychologist and I also do some coaching with People Coach. So, I have loved the People Coach community for the last 4 or so years. And so, today, what we want to share with you all is a little bit of research that we've conducted in Inventium on the future of work, sharing with you some insights that relate to leadership and the challenges that our leaders are facing. And we've got James here who has decades of experience working as a leader and now as a coach as well. So we are going to also shift into a bit of a more of a discussion where I've got some questions for James and he's going to be sharing his experiences and his insights as well. So if this is your first time joining an Inventium webinar, I want you to know that we love to make these super interactive. So feel free to eat your lunch if you're doing that, but I will encourage you to engage in the chat box. I've got it open right there in front of me so I can see we've got people joining from all over Australia as well as someone joining from San Francisco. So welcome, very far away. So I will invite you to jump into the chat box, answer questions, get involved, and we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. Now, you will also see that we've got Uzma here from Inventium. She's sitting there in the background to help out if you have any tech issues. So again, pop that into the chat box if you have any problems. And I want to do a special call out as well to one of our guests, Tony Williams, who joined us 10 minutes early and helped us as we dealt with some tech issues in the background. So thank you, Tony, for bearing with us. And hopefully it's a smooth sailing for everyone else as we go. So let's get into it. I do have a question, as I promised. I've got a question for all of you to get us started. I want to know if you can open up your chat box. I would love to know what you'd like to get out of today. So that's the first question for all of you. I've given you a bit of an update of what we're going to be covering. So let me know in the chat box. It's always good for James and I to get a read of who we've got in the room and what you're looking to get out of the session, so that we can hopefully be a little bit flexible with our agenda and make sure that we deliver something that's really useful for all of you. So let's have a look at what we've got. I was also happy to see we've got an AI companion in here as well. So we know we can get a little bit of a summary if Amelia's note taker wants to share a summary afterwards, we'll take that gladly. All right, so the secret formula of leadership. Have you got that, James?
I've got little bits of it, I reckon.
Awesome. Some new insights about the nature of current changes. Thanks, Tony. Catherine, some practical tips I can use straight away. Great. Sally, inspiration in difficult times. Practical tools to thrive. Mariki says, help. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Mariki. Help, ha, ha, ha. I personally need some magic tools. Yeah, awesome, awesome. Tips and tricks that you can share with your colleagues and embed within your leadership development framework. Great. Different perspectives, love that. Okay, how can I coach leaders to leadership? Okay, cool, awesome. Well, that is good to see. Anything in there that surprised you, James?
No, just one that caught my eye was from Jane, I think, around she references new age. And I guess when we thought about today, it was a lot about there are complexities that are different today and going forward than what, let's say, I'm 51 years old. So when I was managing a lot of people back in the day in corporate world, let's say in my 30s or 40s, there are different complexities. And I guess that's well in our sort of crosshairs for today from Jane in terms of, we're not looking backwards, we're looking forwards as to what leaders need to navigate. So yeah, great, whole lot of great stuff here.
Yeah, and I think that provides a good place for us to start in terms of what I want to do is, as I said, share with you a few of the insights from this research that we conducted in Inventium, and that's going to provide hopefully some nice stimulus and inspiration for our conversation when we'll shift gears into more of an informal chat between James and I. So let's jump straight into that. Basically, my team and I at Inventium, we did this future of work research at the start of this year, where we went out and reviewed the academic and the grey literature to identify a series of workplace trends and things that are impacting the leaders and people across workplaces. And once we had those trends, we then went out and interviewed 15 executives from a range of mostly medium to large organizations, mostly headquartered in here in Australia, but also with offices overseas as well. So we did interview leaders from the organizations on the screen. This is not the total sample because we had a number of people that also chose to stay anonymous. And what you will see from this is that we've got a collection of organizations that are a range of industries. We were speaking to everyone from the chief executive all the way across to head of people and culture, but all definitely at that executive level. And we wanted to really bring that executive and senior leader experience in with a lot of the data and the research that we do have from employee surveys that's already published from institutes like Gartner and also other kind of grey literature from organizations like Deloitte and Atlassian as well. So what I want to share with you is I'm not going to share with you everything from our Future of Work white paper. I'm just going to share with you the key things that really resonated with me and also with you, James, around leadership, because it's been 6 months since we published the white paper, and we've spoken to a lot of leaders about the research since then. And so I'm going to share with all of you the kind of 3 things that have really resonated most with leaders. So again, I do have another question for you all. So open up your chat box again. I'd love for you to capture for me, what does the job description of a people leader or manager typically include? So if you were to write down, I'm assuming that a lot of you here today are people leaders and managers. So if you were to write and capture your job description, maybe you already have a job description written and you can reference that. But what do you actually need to do? What is on your job description? So let's see what everyone comes up with in the chat box. All right, understand organizational goals and transmit them effectively to the team. Great. Achieve results and through their people. Delivery of strategic objectives. Hi, Lundy. What's on my job description goes nowhere near what is needed. Yeah, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there, Jane. Motivation through tough times. Understand the team composition and their strengths. Here we go, Fran, recruitment, wellbeing support, strategic, engagement, encouragement, operations. Yes, all right. So look at this huge list that we have got coming through with the few hundred people that we've got joining today. Let me say, it's a tough gig, right? We expect a lot of our people leaders. And I think that's fair, right? Because we know from the research that people leaders have a significant impact on the engagement and the performance of the teams that they lead. So we know that if we want our organization to be successful, we need leaders that are up at the top of their game, because they are the people that unlock the potential of our people. But we also need to recognize that there is a lot that we are asking of these leaders. And so one of the kind of top insights was this idea that leaders are really struggling to balance their expanding roles and evolving employee expectations. So one of the key themes that came out of the research and the conversations that I had with leaders was this idea of, it's so hard to keep up with employee expectations. They expect so much of us. And on top of that, we're in this kind of sandwich position where we've also got to deal with the expectation of our senior leaders and our executive leaders who are asking us to deliver our business objectives. So we know that the job description of our managers is increasing. And unfortunately, in this day and age, management roles are often characterized by their reliance on soft skills, or what you might like to call people skills. And these soft skills continue to suffer from a lack of sufficient training. So many people are thrust into leadership positions, and most organizations just kind of cross their fingers and just hope that those people will just work it out in terms of, how do I be a really effective leader? So I like how Adam Grant really captures this when he says that management is the only job that you don't practice before you do it. And yet we expect so much of our managers. So we know that our leaders are really at risk of things like burnout and exhaustion and loneliness. And if we have leaders that are not well, then that does have an impact on our teams and how they perform as well. So another question for you all, if I shift into our second insight, I want to know, what do these three people have in common? So we've got Ellen DeGeneres, J.K. Rowling, and Barry Humphries, or as you might know him, Dame Edna Everage. So what do these three people have in common? Yes, they are celebrities. Anything else? Oh, here we go. Has Dame Edna been cancelled? There we go. Second one. Very, very good.
Lauren, I'm going to call out Lauren. She just goes cancelled.
She got it. She got it. So yes, these three people at at one point in their careers, they have all been cancelled. They have been publicly called out, boycotted, and shamed for saying things that were deemed offensive. Now, I am not going to repeat what they said. We don't need to do that. But you might not know specifically what they've been cancelled for, but you probably do know this concept of cancel culture. And cancel culture first appeared in the 2010s. It really became a lot more common around 2018 and has become kind of like a social phenomenon that often is played out on social media. Now, in our research, we heard of the struggles that leaders are facing in communicating effortlessly with an increasingly diverse workforce, especially in a world that is incredibly divided when it comes to social and political issues and how they are permeating the workforce. So we only need to look at what's happening this week and last week in the US to see that what's happening in the political landscape is impacting our workplaces. I received a HBR newsletter last week before the election outcome was announced. And it was an article that said how to speak to your team about the election outcome, regardless of who wins. So we know that this is something that leaders are having to deal with. Like, how do I speak to my team about what's potentially a very triggering decision that's been made about how, arguably the most powerful country in the world is now being run and their leader. So this is having a direct impact on leaders because there's this fear of cancel culture and how it has really permeated the workplace. And leaders are afraid to say the wrong thing. They're afraid that if they make a mistake, they're going to be thrown to the wolves and they're going to be cancelled by their team. And this really raises questions around the psychological safety of not just our teams, but our leaders as well. So we're seeing cancel culture enter the workplace, and it makes it really hard for leaders to know, how can I effectively communicate and lead and inspire my team if I'm afraid of them as well? So I like this quote from an executive from a global tech company, and she said, "This new generation has this high standard of what they expect from people and what they will call out if they don't like. And it changes the way that people communicate." All right, so let's jump into the third insight, and then we're going to stop sharing our screen and jump into more of an informal conversation. So I've got another quote I want to share with you all, and I want to know what you think about this quote. What's your thoughts, your feedback after reading this quote? And James, remember, I'm going to ask you your thoughts as well, so get ready. Here we go. So this is from Brian Kropf, who's the Chief of Research at Gartner. He says, "If you don't want your employees talking to you about their personal situations and needs, and you're not going to be there to support them, odds are you shouldn't be a manager." So what do you think of this? Do you agree? What would the average people leader at your organization say in response to this? James, what do you think?
I'm going to go back a little bit and then come back to this. So if I look back at the comments on the cancel culture observation and insight, something I'd call out is a few people, Helen and Vincent, I remember them in particular, called out things around success of those three individuals. So our insight was about the commonality of them being cancelled. I found it really interesting and relevant as we go forward in this discussion that I think it's indisputable that all three have had huge success in some domain or in some way, as well as getting cancelled. So we'll come back to that. My view broadly on this quote is it's reality whether you like it or not. And something that my background has been in large corporate, leadership roles before becoming a coach, and now I'm often dealing with, as I say, emerging leaders, but also senior execs as a coach these days. And one thing I would say that's related to this is no one's got a gun against your head to be a leader. Like, you don't have to be a leader. So I guess my view is this is actually reality. Um, there are challenges with it. I'd also say that being a leader generally comes with benefits and costs. And this quote really brings up a bunch of costs in my mind, like the cost of leadership on you personally, to have to do these things that are difficult and challenging. And I'd say some obvious benefits of leadership is typically you might have higher earnings, you might have more interesting work or stimulating work. It might bring other benefits like travel or other benefits. So I guess my view is this is actually a sort of a risk and return type equation. Like, do you want to go down a leadership path? No one's got a gun against your head. You can choose to stay an individual contributor, but the risk and return equation is very different in my mind in terms of leadership versus individual contributor roles.
I think that's such a good point. Like, we need to continue to recognize that not everyone needs to be a manager or a leader. We continue to still have these organizational systems that are set up that if you want to progress, you need to become a people leader. And I think that that is fundamentally flawed. And so even thinking about how do we recognize people for going across an organization and becoming a subject matter expert as opposed to just necessarily a leader. So yeah, I think there's a lot of agreement in the chat box, but also a recognition that, you know, we might agree with that, but turning that into action and knowing what to do with that all the time is also not as easy. And you know, I think a lot of us also might look at this and conceptually agree with it, but then when we're in those challenging and tough times, you might kind of, you know, if you're stressed and if you're overwhelmed, you might revert back to that whole thing of, you know, this is just a job and why are they bringing their challenges to me? But it's like, you know, just self-coaching yourself through that in terms of, well, hang on, like, I do value the fact that I need to be a supportive person to the people in my team, and that is my role as a manager. So I do think it's an interesting quote, but basically why I included it is it really points to this increasing challenge that our leaders do have in managing the shifting role when it comes to employee well-being. So I know that a lot of leaders are sitting there and just really questioning, well, what exactly is my role when it comes to employee health and well-being? This is in the midst of, we've obviously had the changes in the legislation around psychosocial hazards, as well as the right to disconnect here in Australia. But also we're operating at a time where we've got a lot of issues with employee burnout and exhaustion. So this research from Deloitte in 2023 found that most employees' health had worsened or stayed the same from the previous year. But what was most interesting to me about this same research was that more than 3 out of 4 executives said their workforce's health had improved. So we're seeing a little bit of a disconnect between the experience of our people and what our leaders are seeing as what's happening. Also, probably the most influential academic research that I have read this year, and I've got to say I read a lot of research as a psychologist, most influential that has really impacted me has been this research out of the University of Oxford that found that through a review in the UK of a whole range of wellbeing interventions that were designed at the individual level, so for individual employees, including resilience training, access to sleep apps, and online coaching, these interventions did not benefit employee well-being. And so it's an interesting time when we're saying we're investing a lot in employee well-being, but we're not necessarily seeing the return on that investment. And when we've got all of these interventions that are just not working and employee well-being is continuing to drop, it means that the issues are being taken to our leaders, right? Because if people are not feeling great, if they're stressed, if they're overwhelmed, they're going to speak to their leader about that. And I think I saw that someone mentioned in the chat box earlier this idea of, yes, Jane, we will share the research. I'll get Uzma. Maybe Uzma can find that. Or if Kira is online, if she is online, she can also share that. Kira's from my team and she helps me with finding great research. But what we're seeing is this basically comes back to our leaders, and they're feeling this pressure to be like almost like a therapist or a psychologist to their teams. And I've got to say, it's not incredibly ethical to be expecting that our managers be a therapist when they're not trained as a therapist. So I guess where I want to finish with this is just recognizing what is your responsibility as a manager. You're not a therapist, but at the same time, we do need to balance that care of our people and recognizing that your people are full people, not just a job and a role. So to kind of, I guess what I've put here is what is your role as a manager is, first of all, is to lead by example. And just recognizing that what you do as a leader directly impacts how your people will behave. It is your job to inquire regularly into your people's health and well-being. You do need to be caring about this and asking, how are you going? How are your stress levels? How's your health? How are you feeling? But it is about focusing on how concerns that your people might be having are impacting their work performance. So if they're experiencing issues in their personal life, ultimately coming back to, okay, and how is that impacting you at work? And how can I support you as your manager to be more effective at work in the midst of these challenges? It's also your responsibility to know the mental health services available and direct people to them. So, thinking about EAP, I know Rebecca just mentioned that in the chat box, knowing what are the resources that are available to people. And at the end of the day, asking questions and listening, there's still so much power in just being that person that your people can go to and share their problems with, without necessarily having you to solve all those problems. So I guess a final quote before we shift into a bit of a discussion about what I've shared. This is a quote from another exec from a tech organization. I'll give you a few seconds to read that. So what I love about this quote is just this idea that we know that to be successful, our leaders are like the multiplier effect, have a multiplier effect in an organization, right? If you can look after your leaders, then they are going to be able to look after their people. And we know that if we want our organizations to be successful, we need to look after our leaders. So in summary, what I've really shared with you, 3 insights just to kind of lay the foundation for today. We know that leaders are struggling to balance their expanding roles and evolving employee expectations. We know that the rise of cancel culture from below can compromise leaders' psychological safety. And we also know that a lot of leaders are questioning what exactly is my role when it comes to employee health and well-being. So we're going to shift gears now into a bit of a discussion and talk through some questions. I've got some questions for James, but as I said, if you have your own responses to these questions that I put to James, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat box as well. So, James, obviously this whole webinar is about leadership in a more complex environment. And we do make that assumption that it is more difficult to be a leader today than it was 2 or 3 decades ago. So I just want to know from you, what do you think it is that's making leadership so complex these days?
Yeah, so I've also been tracking the feedback from a lot of insights and observations. And maybe just before I answer it, I think there's a lot of acknowledgement that generally, yeah, the role has become more complex. I guess, as I said, I feel like it's a choice to become a leader. It should be a choice. It should be a very purposeful choice to weigh up the risks and the costs and the benefits of being a leader versus being an individual contributor. I think there are a lot of factors as to why it's more complex. I think society generally has a lot more questions of organisations, a lot more interest in organisations around, their mission, the social consequences of what they do, etc. I think one thing I'd sort of highlight from my experience working across large publicly listed, global corporations to people coaches, a sort of 5 or 6 year old, now sort of scale up business to a privately held business, is if you're a leader, the complexity that you lead within actually does have a lot to do with the organisation. So, and the concept I guess I want to float here is risk and return, or your risk appetite as a leader. So um, it's easy to sort of spray around these concepts of saying you need to be more empathetic, you need to have discussions with your staff and inquire after their well-being, etc. But all of those activities, they do have some inherent risk. Like there's a risk that as you open up those issues, some blow up in your hands, they become really difficult. They expose your organisation to potential, legal consequences, financial consequences, etc. So I guess one of the things I think is really important for leaders to think about is what's your risk appetite within the context of the organisation you work in. So if I go back, just a little anecdote, I was in an organisation called Honeywell for 16 years, and I ran their Australian New Zealand business before going over to the UK, and then ended up running their Asia Pacific business. But in the UK, it coincided with the London Olympics in 2012. So I got media training in case something blew up around what we were delivering for the Olympics, which included the security systems of the Olympic Stadium, and there was potential great risk. So I got some media training in England, and I thought I'd absolutely nailed this training when I did this sort of mock interview as the head of Honeywell UK. And the woman training me at the end said, "That is the most boring interview I've ever heard, James." And so what I thought I'd nailed is mitigating all the risks of ending up getting Honeywell into some hot water by something I said. But what I'd done is, by taking no risks, I'd actually gained nothing. I'd had no impact as a leader. I'd made no message. And I sort of feel like that's something that we don't talk a lot about is, where do you work? Do you work in a public company where there are shareholders, there's going to be scrutiny, etc.? Do you work in a private company, and what's that company's risk appetite? And what do you want to do as a leader? What do you think the big legacy you want to have for your team, for the organisation is? And what risks do you consciously want to take as a leader? For what gains? And have you weighed that up? So the fact is, that's why I found the comments from our audience around Ellen and Rowling and Dame Hedner so interesting, because they effectively gained so much success and took a lot of risk. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree with their overall sort of persona or what their messages have been in society, but to make gains and to leave a legacy as a leader in a positive way, my view is you have to take risks and you have to weigh up what those are. And it is complex. But I guess in my coaching these days, I feel like there's not a lot of thought that naturally goes into what's my risk appetite as a leader within the context of the organisation.
I think that is so interesting because, as you say it sounds obvious, but if you think about like chosen professions you might have, like my mum's having surgery in 2 weeks, and I'm thinking about the doctor, and I'm thinking, okay, that doctor, and that's a risky job to be in, to be doing, serious surgery on people, and the risk appetite to be a doctor. But you've just kind of highlighted that. Have we sat down and really asked ourselves and acknowledge that, well, also to be a leader, and to be a leader in a complex, potentially publicly listed, transnational organizational, like that's also very risky as well as a job that you might choose to do.
Yeah, and Gareth has just popped up here saying that goes hand in hand with people's fear of failure as a leader. So I 100% agree. So you can sort of, de-risk your leadership style. So don't have any personal discussions with your team members. Don't challenge your boss. Don't challenge your peers. So you can,
Don't
yeah,
show who you really are. Don't be
yeah.
authentic.
Don't show your authentic self. Don't be vulnerable. Don't actually admit that you find something difficult to your team members, etc. The list goes on about how you could de-risk failure, at a sort of simplistic level, but sort of ironically, by completely de-risking your sort of potential failure, you will fail because you're going to gain nothing as a leader.
Yeah, you're going to limit your impact.
Absolutely. And I guess the other thing I'd say around the complexity is, whether it's there's these sensitivities now that didn't exist 10, 20 years ago, like right to disconnect, to separate that work boundary. And, you know, texting an employee or a team member after hours has different consequences to what it would have been 10 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, 1 year ago. So it is more, it is a more complex environment. I think the other theme I'd sort of highlight here is empathetic leadership. And if you're going to lead effectively in a more complex environment, I guess my other view would be you need to be mindful of other people's interests, sensitivities, etc. So, but typically what I'm noticing is everyone thinks about empathetic leadership as top-down only. So I'm a leader of Bob, and I need to really understand if I'm going to get Bob to be really committed and deliver on his objectives. I need to be really empathetic around understanding what makes him tick, what motivates him, what are his sensitivities, etc. But actually, I think if you're a leader that wants really, really sustainable impact, you actually need to have two-way empathy. So you do have to have empathy for what your team members are going through and what challenges they face. But actually, you probably need to have empathy for your boss. What pressure are they under? What are their most significant challenges? And even the executive team and the board, and you know, what pressure are they under? Let's say they're a publicly listed company, and the share price has tanked, and you've got all sorts of issues. So I think actually in this sort of more complex environment, empathetic leadership keeps on being bandied about as a top-down leadership trait. I actually think it's a sort of 360 trait if you want to do it to good effect.
And even if I go back to what you said about, you know, recognizing the complexity of things that have changed in terms of the regulatory environment, I think it's also coming back to what I said around we continue to underinvest in leadership development and supporting your continued professional development. Like, for example, if you are a lawyer, an engineer, or a psychologist, every year I have to do at least 10 hours of professional development.
Yep.
So what you leaders also need to be doing that. You need to be staying up across the legislation that is impacting your role as a leader and the responsibility that you have as well. And that takes time and investment and effort.
And you know, you mentioned your mum's surgeon, whoever they are, pretty sure they haven't just been handed the scalpel without any training. So let's hope. You know, but I think what I also wanted to highlight is the two quotes together that you shared earlier. So there's the quote around the final one you shared around this is the reality of leadership. You do have to, you know, be connected to your people, understand, et cetera, et cetera. But the earlier quote that said leadership is the one job, I think it was Adam Grant, leadership's the one job which people take on with zero training. So it's kind of, and I guess, you know, without turning this into a sales pitch for People Coach, the existence of People Coach, I guess, is all about trying to address that problem to say, why would we think if the complexity is increasing and the challenges are ever increasing for leadership, why would we ever think that it's okay to grab an individual contributor in a domain of expertise like technology or finance or whatever and say, here you go, no training, have a crack at leadership. So I guess my view is if it is more complex, it is more challenging, then surely we've got to do more to train and support leaders when they go down that path.
And so I guess you've already raised the topic of empathy. So I want to know, how can we lead with empathy while still holding your team accountable to performance goals? Because a balancing act that I think is really hard for lots of leaders.
Yeah, and we're keeping on having a look at our chat feedback as well. So I'm conscious, you know, I've got my own experiences as a leader and as a coach, and can leverage, while protecting coachee confidentiality, I can leverage some insights from other people as well. But we'll keep looking for the chat feedback as well. But in terms of, it's interesting, when we asked about what's on your job description and what do you need to do as a leader, there was a lot of information that came through on the chat. I would say 80% of it was around the sort of people skills, empathy, listening, communication, etc. And less than 20% was anything to do with getting results. I did see some people refer to financial objectives and, getting outcomes strategically. But if we're really honest about, what's an organisation trying to achieve, the people leadership, the empathy, etc., is a means to an end to get outcomes for a company. That's reality. That's what shareholders are investing in, or company owners want. They want results. So what we're really saying here is empathetic leadership and all of those things that people are talking about in a leader's job description in a complex world, they really ultimately are better ways to get outcomes and results, whether that's financial, strategic, or otherwise. And I guess that's kind of related to that point I'm making around two-way empathy rather than top-down. So top-down empathy might be solely about, I'm empathizing with my team members and what they're trying to overcome in their world. But sort of two-way empathy is, I know the pressure on getting results, and I guess that also relates to risk. So we're not going to get the results that the organisation has, deemed required without taking any risk. And so, that can be managing poor performance, knowing that there's a potential backlash or a court case that could come your way for an unfair dismissal. That's a risk. Again, no one's got a gun against anyone's head saying you need to be a leader, but that is a genuine part of leadership with a genuine risk that's probably becoming more complex and prevalent than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
And so I guess, is there anything from your experience, like coaching and your own experience as a leader, like specific tools or strategies that you use to kind of manage that balance of empathy and performance?
Yeah, so it's probably one of the most, so we for our emerging and developing leaders in particular, we combine individual coaching with modular frameworks and information that will help leaders learn some practical tips and tricks. I guess one that really stands out for me is there's a book by, and of course, like you'll do research, well-referenced third parties and sources that have a good framework. So one would be what we reference as Courageous Conversations, and we reference Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor, and she has a really simple 2x2 matrix which says radical candor is concurrently having personal care for someone and challenging directly. And so the challenge directly to me relates to, okay, we do need to achieve these results, and you may be falling short of the requirements, or this isn't effective performance, what have you. The care personally is doing it in a way that is empathetic and is not obnoxious. And so that's a 2x2, very simple matrix. If you can imagine an X and a Y axis, one is do you or don't you care personally? The other one is do you or don't you challenge directly? And what we find when we present that to especially emerging and developing leaders, but I would also say senior execs, is the default sort of non-constructive approach is what Kim Scott calls ruinous empathy. And so what that says is you still care personally, but you basically shy away from challenging directly.
It's like when someone has their fly down and you don't tell them they've got.
You don't tell them. Yeah, and so the premise here is it's actually in a sort of medium to long term. Okay, it might be nice to not tell the person they've got the fly down right now because it's a bit embarrassing or awkward. But in terms of the mid to long term, having the challenge directly piece whilst caring personally is actually sustainably going to lead to better performance, and it's actually kind, because not telling the person there's a performance problem ultimately will often lead to further poor performance and disastrous consequences for the individual.
And something that I think always helps me is it's so much easier to keep people aligned with your performance expectations if you are clear upfront in terms of what they are. And so from the very beginning of a project, of a relationship, of a quarter, of a financial year, whenever you can, this is what we expect. And communicating that really clearly and keep coming back to that, because it makes it so much easier to come back to potential poor performance if you've already communicated what you expect. It's something that I kind of come back to always. Yeah, love that, Lauren. Clear is kind. I think that's
Yeah, that's Brene Brown, and we've got, you know, I would say, whether it's Kim Scott, Brene Brown, other authors, other books, I'd actually say all of this stuff. It's interesting. I think Amelia says really easy to implement. I'd say it's easy to understand because it's a simple matrix. I'd say it's bloody hard to implement, as in we often default to ruinous empathy, which is being really kind and caring personally, but actually not challenging directly. And just out of sort of interest, the other big risky quadrant is when you don't care personally and challenge directly, and that's called obnoxious aggression.
mm,
Where you know, so the fly example would be you publicly humiliate the person for having their fly down, as opposed to pulling them aside kindly and letting them know. So, but all of these examples, I know quite a number that have been mentioned here by some of the audience, and I guess it's a classic case of they're all right in my view. They're all kind of logical and realistic around what leaders are navigating, but actually we often shy away from implementing them, and we take the sort of easy short-term path that has long-term negative consequences.
yeah. All right. I want to move on. I'm looking at the time. I want to ask you, James, ultimately, like, how can we help to beat the burnout in our leaders? We know that leaders are potentially the most loneliest group within an organization. We know that they've got a lot of pressure on their shoulders. And
Yep.
as I've already said, they don't have a lot of investment sometimes. So, how can leaders protect themselves as well as their team from burnout?
Yeah, so I've got a pretty, these days, I'm very open about my history, which actually includes what I would say was ultimately a mental health crisis in 2019. And it's funny, I know Kirsten put this comment on the chat a few minutes ago about could be good, could be bad. And so I'd actually say it's funny, you know, at the time, it's like mental health crisis, the worst thing in the world. But it created such a sort of grounding that I decided more purposefully, what do I want to do? And ultimately, Chris Core and I these days are doing something we're more passionate about than ever. But in terms of protecting yourself against what I went through, and I guess now with hindsight, I'd say being, I'd summarize this by saying applying big rock theory, which some people may not be aware of, but if you do an exercise with primary school students, there's a video on this if you look it up, if you YouTube Big Rock Theory. If you get a bunch of kids around and you get a big jar and you get sand, water, and rocks, and you ask them what order should you fill this up so that everything fits. And if they start with the sand and the water, you can never get the big rocks in the container. But if you start with the big rocks, the water and the sand all fits around it and everything fits well. And so I would say big rock theory for leaders has to be what are your personal re-energizing self-care big rocks, and your jar that you put your big rocks into first has to be your calendar. And so for me, I've got time with my kids as a recurring meeting every week in my diary that no one can book a coaching session in or a meeting, etc. I have surfing. I deliberately get on the ocean probably 4 to 5 times a week to make sure that I have the energy to then do my job with empathy, with space and time, etc. So I'd say, to me, if there's one thing I see most linked in my sort of coaching experience and leadership experience to burnout, it would be putting all the sand and the water in, which is a lot about everyone else's priorities, often not that important, and leaving your own big rocks till last. And guess what? They don't fit. You don't get on the ocean. You don't spend time with your kids. You don't go for a walk with the dog or whatever it might be. And if you don't do enough of those big rocks at a personal level, you simply don't have the energy to lead in a complex and challenging environment.
And I think it's really important to just make it super clear that to be an effective leader, you need resources, and well-being is your biggest and best personal resource. And so actually some research I looked at before coming along to today, this was research that came out of Germany that looked at 270 leaders over like a 14-month period. And what they showed was that leaders that had high well-being had more resources, so basically like fuel in the tank that they could invest into being a transformational leader. And we know from the research that transformational leadership has the most significant impacts on team performance. So if you are a transformational leader, you are a leader who inspires your team. You make them feel that their work matters. You provide them with intellectual stimulation, and you care about who they are individually. And so you need those resources to invest in leadership, and that produces team performance. Now, what was interesting about this research was actually that as a flow-on effect, leadership well-being drops. And this makes sense if you think about it from a resources perspective, right? Because you've invested the resources and then you've spent the money. And so you as a leader need to reinvest in yourself to maintain not only team performance, but your own well-being. Otherwise, you're going to burn out. And that's basically what you're saying, James, but I'm just bringing some research.
It's awesome. Well, it's good that the research backs up my opinion. It would have been embarrassing otherwise. So Samantha's just made a comment there around, it's funny, it's a definition of leadership I often actually use with coachees, which is leadership is the art of creating fellowship. It's as simple as that. And I'd say in terms of burnout, I talked about re-energizing. What are your big rocks personally? The research backs it up. I also think I'd go back to that risk appetite and say making a connection. So that comment around creating fellowship and making connection, it comes with risks. Like if you're going to genuinely share, like you could argue sharing in a public forum like this that I had a mental health crisis. Okay, there could be a potential client for People Coach listening on going, well, not so sure I want James's business, providing to us because maybe that's a risk, to us because of his mental health history or whatever. So there is a risk to being open and to being genuine and sharing some level of vulnerability with team members. I guess I'd say if you want effective leadership and you want to be energized and you want to stay healthy, my view is you need to weigh up what risks are you prepared to take in gaining fellowship, because that is leadership. And if you think you can play the most safe game in the world with all of your team members and gain fellowship, I think it's delusional.
Yeah. So we've got 5 minutes left. If you've got any questions, I know you've popped some throughout. So if you have popped a question in the chat box, please repost it because, I mean, it's been awesome to see so much engagement in the chat box. I haven't been able to keep up with it. And we will be sharing the recording and the Future of Work white paper that we did capture at Inventium. So you will get that tomorrow. But if you've got questions, repost that into the chat box. Really keen to use this last 5 minutes to get some answers to your questions. James, was there any question in there that you saw that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I see Haley, who, yes, I think she just reposted it maybe. Anyway, how can you bring others on board with the thinking we have discussed today when they are a barrier to being also to do this work? So executive role. So I'm reading between the lines a little bit on this question, where you're in a leadership role somewhere beneath the exec level and or peer level even, and you're trying to persuade people to think about leadership in some of the ways we've talked about today. How do you actually get cut through with those people? I guess just a few thoughts that come to mind would be, again, it's actually the broken record of empathy. So what perspective does that person come from? So is it a CFO that thinks this is all hot air, and they're very numerically focused and empirical evidence is going to cut through, then maybe it's about finding some research that says, if you do not invest in your leadership, this is some research that demonstrates, staff attrition. That staff attrition equates to this financial damage. So, in my organisation, I've just run some numbers, and if we could reduce attrition from 20% per annum to 10%, my back of envelope calculation is that that's worth this much. And to actually invest in some development for our leaders is actually going to be, 1% of that cost to the business. Whereas if it's a different leader you're trying to convince and get cut through with, it's again, empathetic leadership is what angle are they going to be coming from? And if they keep coming from the same angle and you keep coming from your angle and it's not connecting, then someone's got to change the nature of that dance, and it's probably not going to be them. So, yeah, how are you going to repackage that message?
Awesome. Thanks, James. I've got a question in the Q&A box. We have leaders who are struggling with managing their time and it's affecting their ability to perform, distracted by the ad hoc, not being able to delegate, not being able to reprioritize. Where do you start?
I could just quickly jump. So again, it's in our emerging leader program, we have a module on prioritization and planning. And again, it's something that, you throw a first level leader into the organization after being an individual contributor and just suddenly expect they're going to be able to decipher priorities and create a good plan for every week, etc. I know we've got very limited time. So what I would highlight, just like I did with Courageous Conversations, we use Radical Candor from Kim Scott. We reference the Eisenhower matrix, which really gets anyone at any level in the organization, it really gets you thinking about what's urgent versus what's important. And where I see leaders failing in the mid to long term is they keep prioritizing urgent things, irrespective of whether they're important, over important things. And the way we look at that Eisenhower matrix is the most critical thing to keep coming back to when you're prioritizing your calendar and your appointments, and what you say no to is the big risk items are not getting around to the things that are super important but are not urgent. So no one's hassling you to do them this week. So you just keep kicking the can down the road. And then somewhere down the track, you've got a big problem. Like you've got a problem with your service offering to your customers, or you've got high attrition because you never address those really important things that no one was hassling you over because they weren't week to week important. So again, when we look at prioritization and planning at any level, we sort of, I guess, try and force our leaders, particularly our emerging leaders, to think about what category do all of your tasks that you've currently got on your to-do list fit in, and trying to get more attention on those things that are important but not urgent.
Yeah. And I mean, we do a lot of this at Inventium with our productivity training, which is called our Workday Reinvention program. And I think the most influential thing that we've seen people pick up is this idea of prioritizing every day in your diary, focus time or deep work, recognizing that your value as a knowledge worker and as a leader is with your brain power. And so, thinking about, am I spending time every day on deep work or focus time, or am I spending my whole day in my inbox? Because we might send a lot of emails every year, but when you get to the end of the year, it's not the emails that you're going to remember. And I think just before we finish, one really practical tip I would say with that as well, in terms of managing your time, because as a leader, you've got lots of people asking things of you, is to use this strategy of saying yes, but. It can be really hard to say no, but if you say yes, but I can't get that to you till next week, or yes, but then I would have to not do this, or yes, but I need to do that next quarter. So it can be a nice, really simple strategy to just help you to kind of say yes, but put some boundaries and also protect your time as well. So it's just gone 1 minute past the hour. We've got to wrap up. I will say thank you so much for everyone for joining. It was our first time doing a webinar together, People Coach Inventium. We hope you found it valuable. We will share the recording and our Future of Work white paper tomorrow. We're so grateful to you for your time. We know your time is precious. We hope you found it valuable. And thank you so much, James and Ozma, as well, for being my co-pilots.
Thanks, great leadership, Charlotte, and thanks so much for so many awesome insights and questions from all of the audience. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.